Prepare for a rude awakening.
Shalom, Torah fans. This is Michael Rood, welcoming you to the 8th episode of the 11-part series, The Creator's Calendar and the Restoration of All Things. Tradition can blind us from the truth and cause us to wander in the myopic fog of man-made religion for a lifetime. Most of the religious traditions that we have inherited in the Western world have come directly from Babylon, including our reckoning of time. Judaism also has its share of traditions which also turn our eyes from the truth, and a reckoning of time that diverges from the Creator's original calendar as well. Now we join our guest teacher, Dead Sea Scroll scholar Nehemiah Gordon, in the hill country of Judea as we continue this amazing adventure of discovering the Creator's reckoning of time, so that we, the children of light, might not be ignorant of His times and His seasons. The Creator's calendar and the Feast of the Lord are detailed prophetic shadow pictures of good things to come.
We live in an amazing time of restoration. For nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people were scattered across the lands of the dispersion, and now we're back in the land of Israel.
A Rude Awakening Television presents The Creator's Calendar and the Restoration of All Things. A special presentation from Israel by Michael Rood and Nehemiah Gordon.
We're first told about the biblical calendar in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. And there it says, "And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to separate between daytime and nighttime, and they shall be for signs, for appointed times, for days and for years." And the Hebrew word there for appointed times is often translated as seasons, but actually appointed times is more accurate. The Hebrew word is moadim. And moadim, or the singular moed, means a time that's set, an established time. And what it's telling us here is that the lights in heaven, the sun and the moon, somehow are indicators for us for the appointed times, for the biblical feasts, for the feasts of the Lord. Our next clue comes in Psalm 104:19. And there we're told, Asa yarech moadim. He made the moon for appointed times. He made the moon for moadim. And so clearly the biblical calendar has something to do with the moon. But what exactly does it have to do with the moon? One of the things people say to me all the time is, show me a verse in Scripture where it says to look for the new moon. And there actually isn't a verse that says that. And the reason is that the very Hebrew word for month means new moon. The Hebrew word for month is chodesh. And the Hebrew word chodesh literally means new moon. You can see it used that way in throughout Scripture. For example, 1 Samuel chapter 20, the word chodesh appears with the literal sense of new moon. Now, if the word for month means new moon, it's a pretty good guess or pretty good conclusion to say that the month is actually based on the sighting of the new moon. The Hebrew word for chodesh, month, new moon, comes from the word chadash, which means new or renewal. And actually, this is a word that many people are familiar with from the phrase Brit Chadashah. Brit Chadashah is the Hebrew word which is often translated as New Testament. What it literally means, though, is renewed covenant. Brit is covenant, Chadashah is new or renewal. And the Hebrew idea of Chadash is not something brand new that never existed before. The idea is actually a renewal. And that's what Jeremiah 31 is talking about. The covenant has been broken, and in the future period that Jeremiah is talking about, this covenant will be renewed. And that's exactly what a chodesh, a new moon, is. The month is not visible for several days. You go out and you look for the moon for several days and you don't see it. And then the light of the moon, or the visibility of the moon, is renewed to observers looking for it up on the western horizon shortly after sunset. Now, the way the lunar cycle works, here we can see the sun, the moon, and the earth in a straight line, and this is what's known as the moment of conjunction. And at this point, you simply can't see the moon because when you look up, all you see is the sun. That's the first reason. The second reason you don't see the moon is that the side of the moon facing us on Earth is not illuminated. Now, here's a very important point that a lot of people don't get. 50% of the moon is always illuminated. Even at this moment of conjunction, half the moon is lit up, except the half that's lit up is not facing Earth. And so we can't see it. A day or two later, you have what then is actually the visible new moon. At that point, 50% of the moon is still illuminated. However, now enough of it is facing Earth that when we look up on the western horizon shortly after sunset, we can see the moon as a tiny sliver crescent. And this is what it actually looks like looking at the horizon from Jerusalem. This is a new moon sighted from Jerusalem. Here's another new moon which you can see from Jerusalem. Any simple ancient Israelite shepherd or farmer goes up to any hilltop and he can't miss seeing the new moon. It's just so clear. The ancient Israelites were so in tune with the cycles of nature. They didn't have artificial lights. They woke up with first light and they went to sleep after the complete darkness. I mentioned how in ancient times the new moon was proclaimed from Jerusalem. What they would do is they would light a bonfire at the top of one of the hills next to Jerusalem, and then someone on a far distant hill would see that bonfire and he would light a bonfire, and this created a string of bonfires at the top of all of the hills all across the land of Israel. And people far away, hundreds of miles from Jerusalem, knew almost instantaneously that the new moon had been sighted from Jerusalem, unless you lived very far away in Babylonia or in Egypt. And in that case, you couldn't see the bonfires, and you had to keep 2 days for every biblical feast. Well, today we live in a miraculous age where we can click a button and send an email around the world, and even the people in the farthest reaches of the diaspora don't have to keep 2 days. They can find out instantaneously that the new moon was sighted from Jerusalem. For a number of years now, we've been reporting these new moon sightings from Jerusalem. On my website, you can sign up for a free newsletter at karaites.com, and you get a free newsletter finding out instantaneously when the new moon was sighted. And so really there's no more excuse today to be following this Hillel 2 calendar, which was based on the idea that the Jews would be sent off into the exile. Hey, excuse me. I'm down here in the corner, in the Karaite corner. Before we continue, we need to look at a very important question concerning New Moon Day. We've just learned that the new moon is the beginning of the biblical month. But the question still remains, what is the status of New Moon Day? Is the new moon a day of rest like the Sabbath and the appointed times? In Numbers chapter 28, it says that a special sacrifice must be brought on the day of the new moon. But is New Moon Day really a day of rest? Recently, some people have suggested that the day of the new moon is a day of rest. They base this on an interesting passage in Amos chapter 8, verse 5. In that passage, the prophet rebukes the ancient Israelite merchants who could not wait to sell their grain to the poor. The prophet quotes the merchants who say in their hearts, "When will the new moon pass so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale?" In this verse, the merchants are eagerly anticipating the end of the Sabbath and the new moon so they can sell their grain to the needy. It's clear why the merchants want the Sabbath to end. We are commanded to refrain from all work on the Sabbath, and that includes engaging in any form of commerce, such as buying and selling. In fact, in Nehemiah chapter 13, the people are rebuked for selling their wares on the Sabbath. The merchants in Amos want the Sabbath to end so they can finally sell their grain. But why are the merchants so eager for the new moon to end? This seems to imply that it was forbidden to sell grain on the new moon, just as it was on the Sabbath. Based on this verse, some people have recently suggested that the new moon must be observed as a day of rest, even though that it is not commanded anywhere in the Torah. They also point out that there are a number of verses in Scripture in which the new moon and Sabbath appear side by side. For example, in Isaiah 66, verse 23, the prophet speaks about the new heavens and the new earth in the end times, saying, "And it shall come to pass, every new moon and every Sabbath, all flesh shall come to bow down before me, says Jehovah." So in the future era, when the King Messiah reigns over the earth, every human being will come to worship before Jehovah every Sabbath and every new moon. On a side note, we can see that in the future Messianic era, the Sabbath will still be kept. Another verse in which the Sabbath and new moon appear side by side is 2 Kings chapter 4. In that passage, we read about the Shunammite woman who was a disciple of the prophet Elisha. Elisha blesses the barren woman with a son. When her son dies, she decides to quickly go to the prophet for guidance. In verse 22, we read as follows, "And she called her husband and she said, 'Send me please one of the young servants and one of the she-donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and afterwards return.' And he answered, 'Why do you go to him today? Today is neither new moon nor Sabbath. Clearly, the Shunammite woman had a custom of going every new moon and every Sabbath to hear the words of the prophet. Interestingly enough, this woman's custom of going to the prophet is probably the forerunner of the synagogue. Today, the main function of the synagogue is for public prayer by rote. But before the destruction of the Second Temple, the first synagogues were places for the people to gather to hear the words of Scripture read out loud every Sabbath. Originally, the people would go every Sabbath to hear the words from the prophets themselves. Later, when prophecy ceased, the people would gather at the synagogues to hear the words of the prophets recorded in Scripture. In verse 24, we see that the Shunammite woman goes to hear the words of the prophet not only every Sabbath, but also every new moon. Verses such as these have suggested to some people that the new moon was intended as a day of rest, just like the Sabbath. The problem with this idea is that the Torah never actually commands us to rest on the day of the new moon. If the Torah does not command us to rest on the Sabbath, then how could the prophet Amos command us to do so? The Torah itself forbids us from adding new laws. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2, "You shall not add unto the matter which I command you today, nor shall you diminish anything from it." We are specifically forbidden from adding new laws to the Torah of Moses, just as we are forbidden from abolishing laws. This appears a second time in Deuteronomy 12:32. "All that I am commanding you shall diligently do. You shall not add to it or diminish from it." Again, we are forbidden to add to the Torah. Even a prophet such as Amos will be forbidden to add to the Torah. This is made clear in the very next verses that follow in Deuteronomy 13. There we are warned that if a prophet appears performing genuine signs and miracles, but telling us to do something other than what is commanded in the Torah, we are not to listen to him. He is a false prophet who has been sent to test us. Clearly, Amos could not have added a commandment to rest on the new moon, because that would have made him a false prophet. So why couldn't the merchants in Amos 8:5 sell their grain until the new moon passed? I want to propose an alternative explanation of this verse, an explanation that appears in the Targum Jonathan, an ancient Jewish translational commentary on the prophets. According to this explanation, the Sabbath in Amos 8:5 is not the weekly Sabbath, but the yearly Sabbath, what's called in English the sabbatical year. The sabbatical year is commanded in Leviticus 25, which says, 6 years you shall sow your field, but the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest for the land. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard." We're not allowed to plant crops in the sabbatical year. In verse 5, it continues, and it speaks there about the aftergrowth, meaning grain that grows from seed that falls during previous year's harvest. In verse 5 it says, "That which grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap. It is a year of rest for the land." Some people stop reading here and erroneously conclude that we are not allowed to eat anything that grows during the sabbatical year. But actually, the point of prohibiting a harvest is to allow anyone who wants to go into the field and cut as much grain as they need. This is explained in verses 6 and 7 of chapter 25. It goes on, it says, "But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female servants, the hired servants, and the bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield." So the prohibition is to carry out a centralized harvest. On the sabbatical year, everyone is allowed to go into any field and cut whatever they need for survival. This is why the merchants in Amos 8 are so eager for the sabbatical year to end. During the sabbatical year, their grain sits collecting dust in the storehouses. The poor don't need to buy any grain because they can simply go into any field and cut whatever they need. But as soon as the sabbatical year ends, grain prices will skyrocket and the merchants will be able to gouge the needy. This is what the prophet was talking about when he said in Amos 8, "Listen to you who devour the needy, annihilating the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon pass so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale? We will make the ephah small and the shekel great, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat." The ephah was a solid measure of volume like a modern bushel, and the shekel was a measure of weight. The merchants would deceitfully use smaller weights and measures when they were selling and larger ones when they were buying. This was all part of the price gouging of the poor. The rich merchants are desperate for the sabbatical year to end so they can get back to business as usual, selling their grain to the poor at high and unfair prices. If the Sabbath in Amos 8:5 is the sabbatical year, what about the new moon? Remember how we said that the Hebrew word for new moon also means month? According to the ancient Targum, the new moon in Amos 8:5 is actually the last month of the sabbatical year. Throughout that last month, the poor can get all the free grain they want by simply walking out to any field. At the same time, the reserve supply of grain from previous years is dwindling as the sabbatical year winds to a close. The merchants are desperately waiting for the month that ends the sabbatical year to pass so they can finally sell their grain at unfair prices to the poor. This is the ancient Jewish understanding of the verse presented in the Targum, and it lines up perfectly with what we read in the Torah. Amos is not saying it is forbidden to work on the new moon day. Amos could not say this because the Torah never forbids us to work on new moon day. Instead, Amos is just speaking about the month that ends the sabbatical year when the grain prices are teetering on the edge of skyrocketing. The point in Amos is that the merchants want to take advantage of the poor by charging unjust prices in order to enslave them. Now that we understand that the new moon is not a day of rest, let's get back to Nehemiah. We know full well exactly what was done up until the time of Hillel II. We have ancient documents which describe exactly how the biblical calendar functioned before Hillel II came along and changed it in 359. One of the ancient sources is actually a pre-Hillel II Pharisee source called the Mishnah, which has an entire tractate called the Tractate of Rosh Hashanah. And there it describes in great detail how when the temple stood, the court would interrogate new moon witnesses to find out when they saw it and where they saw it and what they saw. And based on that, they would proclaim that the new moon had been sighted in the land of Israel. And here's a really amazing account that appears in this Tractate of Rosh Hashanah, which tells about an actual new moon sighting that took place in Jerusalem. And it relates as follows. It says, "It once happened that Tobias the physician saw the Chodesh." Chodesh, remember we said, was the Hebrew word for new moon. So he saw the Chodesh, he saw the new moon in Jerusalem together with his son and his emancipated slave. The Sadducee priests accepted the testimony of Tobias and his son, but rejected the testimony of his slave. When they came before the Pharisee court, they accepted the testimony of Tobias and his slave, but rejected the testimony of his son. What this account tells us is that there were two courts, two judicial bodies convening in Jerusalem, one of the Sadducees, the other of the Pharisees, and they both received new moon testimony, and somebody who saw the new moon would actually go and testify before each court. And what this tells us is that with all the differences among the different factions in Jerusalem at the time of the Second Temple, the one thing all the Jews in Jerusalem agreed upon was that the month began with the sighting of the new moon. Well, this raises an interesting question of what we do today, because today we don't have a Pharisee court and we don't have a council of Sadducean priests who are sitting in the temple. And a lot of people have said because of this, they've asked the question, do we really have the authority to restore the original biblical calendar? In other words, we don't have a council to say we've seen the moon, so how do we know the moon has really been seen? And that's a very valid question, and let's examine this. And ultimately what these people are saying is that we have to continue to follow the Hillel II calendar, which has the stamp of authority of the last Sanhedrin in the year 359, approximately a little over 300 years after Yeshua's ministry. The reason we have to follow the Hillel II decision is because they were the last Sanhedrin, and today we don't have a Sanhedrin. We don't have that authority today. Well, before we decide whether we should continue to follow the decision of a Sanhedrin from 1600 years ago, let's understand what authority that Sanhedrin actually claimed. What was the authority claimed by the Sanhedrin? And we can find this out by actually looking back in this Tractate of Rosh Hashanah and seeing a principle which is laid down there. And there the rabbis say as follows. They say, if the court and all Israel saw the new moon, and the witnesses were interrogated, but the court did not have time to declare it sanctified, meaning there was actually a ceremony where the members of the court would stand up after they heard new moon testimony and say, sanctified, sanctified, sanctified. If they didn't have time to make that declaration, the previous month is 30 days. What that means is, if the moon was seen after 29 days, remember you look after 29 days, and if it's not seen then it's the next evening by default. If you look for the moon after the end of 29 days, and all of Israel, hundreds of thousands of Israelites have seen the new moon, but the court hasn't said they've seen the new moon, the court hasn't proclaimed it so, then it's the next day by default. And the principle here that the rabbis are laying down is that the sighting of the new moon isn't what makes it new moon day. What makes it new moon day by definition is the proclamation of the court. Whether this moon is seen or not, whether the rabbis are even wrong or not, by definition what makes it new moon day is the proclamation of the court. And this comes out very clearly in a story which appears in the same tractate of Rosh Hashanah. There it tells what's actually a foundational story in Pharisee theology, which is the story of Rabbi Joshua and Gamliel II. Of course, you all have heard of Gamliel I, who is the teacher of Shaul, Paul of Tarsus. This is his grandson, Gamliel II, who was the head of the Sanhedrin shortly after the destruction of the temple. And the story goes as follows. One day, Rabban Gamliel II was receiving the testimony of new moon witnesses, and they came and they said something that was completely impossible. They claimed to have seen the new moon in such a way that everyone sitting there knew that this was impossible. They couldn't be telling the truth. It's impossible that the new moon was really sighted. And Rabbi Joshua hears this, and he realizes, wait a minute, they didn't really see the new moon, even though they claimed it. Well, Rabban Gamliel II accepted their testimony, and he was the head of the court. So this actually placed Rabbi Joshua in a very difficult situation. What does he do now? He knows that the new moon wasn't sighted, but the rabbinical court has proclaimed that it was sighted. So now he has a contradiction between the authority of the day and his conscience. Well, what he decides to do is he says, I'm just going to keep it in my house. And by the way, this was the 7th month, the month with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is a 24-hour fast. And if it was any other holiday, Rabbi Joshua would have kept each day for 2 days, one based on the actual sighting of the moon, and the other based on the proclamation of Rabban Gamliel. But here he can't do it. He can't fast for 2 days straight for Yom Kippur, for Day of Atonement. It's too difficult. So what he decides to do is he's going to keep it in his house and no one will know, and he just won't go to synagogue that day. Well, Rabban Gamliel hears about this and he says, absolutely not. Not only will you observe the day of Yom Kippur on the day that the court says, but in the day that you think is Yom Kippur, the day before, you will appear before me with your staff in your hand and your money purse at your side. And to a Pharisee, to be holding his staff in his hand and his money purse at his side is actually a public desecration of the day. You would only do that on a weekday, and on a non-holy day, you wouldn't do that on the Day of Atonement. So what Rabban Gamliel is actually ordering Rabbi Joshua to do is to publicly desecrate the day that he believes to be Yom Kippur. Rabbi Joshua doesn't know what to do. He's very distraught. So he goes and he seeks the advice of various rabbis. One of them, named Rabbi Dosa, a little-known rabbi, says to Rabbi Joshua, he says, you can't defy the proclamation of the court. They have the authority of Moses. They sit in the place of Moses. If you defy the court of Rabban Gamliel, whether he's right or wrong, you're defying Moses himself. Rabbi Joshua is very distraught over this. He doesn't know what to do. He now has this contradiction between his conscience of following the factual truth as he understands it and this authoritative decree of the court. He goes and he seeks further advice, and he goes to Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva sits him down. Rabbi Akiva was the greatest rabbi of the 2nd century, late 1st century, early 2nd century. And he says, Rabbi Joshua, it says 3 times in the Torah, you shall proclaim them, the appointed times. But you should read it as you yourself shall proclaim. What's he talking about? He was actually using an ingenious exegetical device, changing the vowels of one of the Hebrew words, changing the verse in Scripture to, you shall proclaim the appointed times, to you yourselves shall proclaim the appointed times. Let's look at what that is exactly. Leviticus 23 verse 4 says, these are the appointed times of Yehovah, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim them in their appointed times. And what that clearly says to anybody who casually reads that is you have to proclaim the appointed times. When do you proclaim them? In their appointed times. Rabbi Akiva, the first thing he did is he cut off the words in their appointed times. When he read it to Rabbi Joshua, he said, let's get rid of those words. They don't really make the point I'm trying to make. And then instead of reading it, you shall proclaim them, let's read it, you yourself shall proclaim. And what that now means, the way we're reading it now, and by the way, in Hebrew, that's the same consonants, just a change of certain vowels. What it now means is that whenever you proclaim those times is by definition when they are. You don't have to proclaim them when they're appointed. You have to proclaim them. You proclaim them whenever you decide to, you yourselves. And Rabbi Akiva explained what he meant. He said to him as follows. He says, you yourselves proclaim them, you being the rabbinical court. And what that means is, even if you, the court, is accidentally wrong, even if you are intentionally wrong, and even if you are misled. And what this meant is the actual factual evidence, the actual factual information of when the moon was sighted is completely irrelevant. the holy days are by definition when the court proclaims them to be. Well, I have a real problem with this because that's not what it really says in Leviticus 23 verse 4. What it really says, as Rabbi Akiva knew very well, is that these are the appointed times of Jehovah, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim them. That's what it literally says in Hebrew. You shall proclaim them in their appointed times, not whenever you feel like. It is your duty to proclaim them, but you don't appoint them. The Almighty in heaven, the Creator, appoints them. And so I have a hard time accepting this decision of Rabbi Akiva because he's telling me that the proclamation of the rabbis is what makes them appointed times and not the Creator. They become the feasts of the rabbis and not the feasts of the Lord.
In the course of this teaching series, I have often referred to the journey of discovery that led me to the ancient path of understanding the Creator's original reckoning of time. It is gratifying to look back over the years and see that everything that we experience in life, both the bitter and the sweet, can all work together for good if we love Yahweh and are called according to His purpose. We all desire to live a meaningful life, and when we commit our ways to Him, He will direct our path. It will probably lead through the valley of the shadow of death, where there are venomous serpents along the way, but He will strengthen us with every test. In the end, all we really want to hear are the words, "Well done, good job, faithful servant." Join us again next time as we continue our adventure of discovering the Creator's calendar and the restoration of all things. This is Michael Rood bidding you shalom, peace, and I will see you when the smoke clears.